Hey guys, tonight we are diving into something a little more mysterious, a little more shadow-shrouded than our usual wanderings through cobblestone streets and dusty archives. You find yourself padding softly through the corridors of a temple, the kind where flickering oil lamps smear light across walls carved with stories older than anyone can truly remember. The air is thick with incense, resinous and sweet, the kind that clings to your hair and makes you sneeze at the most inappropriate times. Every sound feels magnified. The creak of your sandals on stone, the faint rustle of linen, the occasional cough someone tries very hard to smother. These are whispered halls, where secrets about kings, queens, and divine obligations were supposedly carried out far from the eyes of common folk. And before you get too relaxed or too nervous about what's coming next, let's pause for a quick reality check. If you were really here in one of these rituals, with your less than perfect modern posture and maybe a tendency to giggle at the wrong moment, you probably wouldn't survive the first hour without being shushed into oblivion. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop a comment with your location and your local time. I love seeing how scattered across the world this sleepy little history family has become. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move further down the temple passage, where flickers of lamplight meet painted murals that seem to shift as the flame bends. The stone under your hands is cool, and your fingertips trace grooves worn by centuries of priests and nervous novices. Somewhere ahead you catch the low murmur of voices, muffled as though wrapped in cloth. The air grows warmer, heavier, and you realize you're nearing the chamber where whispered vows once mingled with smoke, perfume, and nervous anticipation. Historians still argue whether these spaces were literal sites of sacred marriage ceremonies or merely symbolic acts designed to make kings feel divine. One camp says it was all theater, incense, chanting, dramatic staging, a little like the over-budget high school play you were once in. Another insists there may have been more physical dimensions to the rituals, hushed away in carefully guarded records. The evidence? Fragmentary texts, temple carvings, and the occasional scandalized traveler's diary that scholars now squint at like suspicious receipts. And here's your first quirky tidbit. In some cultures, priests actually whispered vows directly into statues. Imagine leaning in close to a massive stone god and mumbling promises like a teenager confessing a crush to a diary. The ritual made sense at the time, speaking your secret desires straight to the divine, bypassing human judgment. But if anyone walked in while you were doing it, you'd look like you were gossiping with a wall. The mainstream fact is that many ancient temples included dedicated inner sanctuaries where commoners were never allowed. These spaces weren't just quiet. They were physically restricted by architecture, false doors, narrow passageways, even misleading murals meant to confuse outsiders. It was the original "Do Not Disturb" sign, except carved in stone and guarded by men who definitely skipped leg day, but still knew how to hold a spear. And you, wandering slowly, notice how easy it is for your imagination to fill in the blanks. A soft laugh, a rattle of jewelry, the rustle of linen. You wonder if those who participated in the rituals really believed the gods were watching, or if, like you, they occasionally got distracted by the flickering lamps and thought about dinner. The atmosphere is heavy, but not frightening. Think of it as a mixture of library silence and spa background music, but with more sandalwood smoke. You can almost hear the echo of sandals scuffing, the hushed clink of vessels being set down, the rhythmic chanting bouncing from wall to wall. You sense the tension between solemn duty and very human nerves. After all, no matter how divine the setting, someone still had to sneeze, cough, or whisper, "Are we done yet?" This temple corridor leads you not just into history's shadows, but into the space between fact and myth, where whispered secrets and dusty stone hold more questions than answers. And as you keep tracing those grooves in the walls, you realize, tonight, you get to linger here, where every whisper feels like it might matter, even if no one alive can confirm what was truly said. You drift now into the land between two rivers, where the air is heavy with the scent of reeds, baked clay, and the faint sourness of old beer. Babylon at night feels both endless and intimate, the kind of place where torches flicker on mud brick walls and from rooftops you can hear lutes strumming lullabies to half-sleeping children. Tonight, though, your footsteps carry you not toward a family courtyard, but toward one of those whispered fertility rites that later writers never stopped speculating about. Here's the mainstream fact. Mesopotamian kings sometimes performed what scholars call the sacred marriage, a ritual union meant to bind the ruler with the goddess Inanna, or Ishtar, depending on which text you squint at. The rite wasn't just mystical romance, it was agricultural insurance. If the king and the goddess were properly married, the land would yield barley, dates, and enough sheep to keep everyone from complaining too loudly. Imagine your entire economy depending on whether a ritual wedding went smoothly. That's pressure. And then comes the quirky tidbit. Some clay tablets suggest that these ceremonies involved priests reading surprisingly steamy poetry aloud. Think lines about honey, milk, and gardens, but delivered in the solemn tones of a librarian. One can only imagine the poor scribe desperately chiseling those metaphors onto wet clay, probably blushing as badly as you do when your phone autocorrects ducking in the worst possible text message. Historians still argue whether the king himself actually performed any physical role in the ritual, or if it was symbolic, with stand-ins handling the details. Some say the high priestess took part, embodying Inanna. Others argue the whole thing might have been pantomime, like a passion play with a lot more awkward eye contact. The truth remains locked in half-broken tablets, where gaps in the text could either mean embraced tenderly or offered 3 sheep and a jug of beer. Hard to say. You imagine yourself slipping into one of those torchlit chambers, where woven reed mats cover the floors and walls, painted with bright pigments now lost to dust. The crowd is hushed, though a few murmurs ripple like water. Priests in layered robes chant verses older than the language you think in. Someone beats a frame drum softly, a rhythm meant to echo the heartbeat of the land itself. You feel it in your chest, low and steady, like the sound of a train in the distance. And yet, here comes the gentle sarcasm, the idea that Babylonian farmers genuinely believed the king's night of ritual marriage would guarantee next season's crops. Makes you wonder if Mesopotamian weather forecasts were just as inaccurate as the app on your phone. You can picture a farmer shaking his head when the rains failed. Guess His Majesty wasn't feeling very convincing this year. Still, beneath the humor lies the awe of a civilization that tied the fertility of soil to the bodies of rulers. To walk here is to feel that odd blend of cosmic and human, divine and frankly awkward, that defines so many ancient rites. The incense is strong enough to sting your nose, and the heat of packed bodies makes the torchlight shimmer as if the walls themselves are breathing. You wonder if participants truly felt the presence of Inanna descending into the room, or if they just swayed with the rhythm, comforted by tradition. Outside, the city would be alive with its own noises, donkey carts squeaking, water sellers calling out, couples whispering from balconies. But inside, time shrinks to a single room, a single night, where the fate of crops and cattle supposedly rests on ritual unions hidden from the world. And as you stand there, half participant and half ghost, you realize this is less about scandal than about survival. For people whose lives depended on barley sprouting in the fields, a sacred marriage was just as crucial as irrigation canals or seed storage. Your sandals scrape against the packed earth as you step back, the drumming fading, the chants echoing. The air is thick. The whispers are softer now, but the memory lingers, that kings and gods, humans and harvests, were all bound together in rites that history both reveals and carefully conceals. You find yourself following the Nile now, where the night air is cooler, carrying the scent of wet papyrus and the faint sweetness of lotus blossoms drifting on the current. Torches flicker on temple pylons carved with scenes of gods towering over kings, their arms outstretched in poses that seem both protective and judgmental. You step softly across the cool flagstones, moving deeper into the inner court where ancient whispers still cling to the walls. This is Egypt, and here, royal unions weren't just political. They were staged to echo the eternal cycles of the cosmos. The mainstream fact is straightforward enough. Pharaohs were often depicted as the earthly spouse of goddesses, most notably Hathor, the embodiment of love, beauty, and fertility. The annual festivals at Dendera or Edfu sometimes reenacted sacred marriages meant to ensure cosmic harmony. The rituals linked the ruler not only to divine legitimacy, but to the fertility of the Nile itself. After all, if the river didn't flood properly, grain stores dwindled and the people grumbled. Imagine tying your authority to a river with a mind of its own. It's like staking your career on whether your neighbor's cat decides to cooperate. Now, for the quirky tidbit. Some texts suggest that offerings of symbolic foods were central to these rituals. Things like cucumbers, fish, and round loaves of bread. The symbolism was, let's say, not particularly subtle. You picture a solemn priest presenting a plate of cucumbers with the most serious face imaginable, while the rest of the temple staff tried very hard not to laugh. Even the gods you suspect might have rolled their celestial eyes. And of course, historians still argue whether the sacred marriage was performed literally by the pharaoh and a priestess, or whether it was purely symbolic, enacted through statues, hymns, and ritual feasts. Some Egyptologists insist it was all ceremony, with carved reliefs showing offerings and chants rather than any physical union. Others point to cryptic hymns that sound suspiciously like bridal songs, leaving just enough ambiguity to spark centuries of debate. You walk deeper into the sanctum. The stone walls close in, painted with vivid blues and golds that flicker in lamplight, creating the illusion of movement, like gods breathing through pigment. The air is thick with incense, resinous and sharp, so heavy it feels like you could slice it with a reed knife. A priest chants in a voice that seems to vibrate through your chest, low and resonant, carrying words about renewal, balance, and the endless flood of the Nile. And yet, here's where the humor slips in. Imagine yourself as a nervous pharaoh, expected to embody a god's spouse in front of the entire priestly class, while holding a cucumber in one hand and a jug of beer in the other. The pressure would make even the most regal face twitch. You probably wouldn't survive a minute without coughing, sneezing, or accidentally spilling beer on your sandals. Still, the sense of grandeur is undeniable. You hear the rustle of linen robes, the shuffle of feet on stone, the low hum of attendants repeating phrases like echoes. You catch a glimpse of a carved relief showing the goddess Hathor offering her hand to the king, and suddenly it makes sense. This wasn't just performance, it was reassurance. For the farmer tending his fields outside, for the mother grinding grain in her courtyard, the idea that Pharaoh was married to a goddess meant that the world itself was stable, that the floods would return, that life would go on. The torches flare as the night deepens, casting tall shadows across columns shaped like bundled papyrus stalks. You sense the moment reaching its quiet crescendo. Voices lower, the rhythm slows, and you almost feel the presence of the river itself flowing through the room. It's calm, steady, and oddly soothing. You step back into the courtyard, the stars scattered above like shards of silver. The temple behind you hums with the lingering resonance of vows whispered into the darkness. Somewhere far off, the Nile laps against its banks, steady and eternal, carrying with it the secret weight of unions performed for gods and mortals alike. You drift westward now, past the Aegean waters that sparkle like spilled coins in the sun, though tonight the sea is dark, carrying the faint salt smell that sticks to your lips. The stone pathways of Greece lead you uphill, into a grove of sacred cypress and olive trees. The air is heavy with the buzz of cicadas, though their voices soften as you approach the torches marking the entrance to a sanctuary. Tonight, you've found yourself brushing against the edges of the Greek mysteries, rites so carefully hidden that even their initiates were sworn to silence on pain of death. The mainstream fact is this: the Eleusinian Mysteries, held in honor of Demeter and Persephone, were among the most sacred rituals of ancient Greece. For centuries, Athenians and foreigners alike made pilgrimages to Eleusis to be initiated. These ceremonies promised blessed afterlives, renewal, and divine closeness, though the precise details remain cloaked in secrecy. Even today, no one knows exactly what happened inside those torchlit halls. Here comes the quirky tidbit. Ancient sources hint that part of the ritual may have involved drinking a special potion called kykeon, brewed with barley and mint. Some modern scholars even suggest it might have had mild hallucinogenic properties, thanks to ergot fungus that occasionally grew on the grain. Picture yourself in a solemn ritual, clutching your sacred barley drink and suddenly realizing your vision of Demeter might just be a fungal side effect. It's the kind of mistake that could turn a holy night into an awkward one. Historians still argue whether the mysteries included symbolic reenactments of Persephone's descent into the underworld, or whether something more physical, perhaps even sensual, was staged. The evidence is frustratingly thin. Fragments of pottery, cryptic hymns, scattered remarks from writers who were definitely not supposed to be spilling secrets. Some claim the initiates saw sacred objects revealed by torchlight. Others suggest they listened to powerful words whispered in the hush of midnight. Was it symbolic drama? A communal trance? A mixture of both? No one can say for sure. You enter the dimly lit hall, its stone walls echoing with hushed chants. Torches line the periphery, their flames smearing shadows across the faces of those gathered. You sense the anticipation, like the moment before a curtain rises in a theater. Robes whisper against the floor, and bare feet shuffle nervously. Someone coughs, too loudly, and quickly earns a sharp look from a fellow initiate. Even in the midst of sacred awe, human awkwardness sneaks in. The atmosphere is thick, almost tactile, as if the darkness itself has weight. You close your eyes and hear the rhythmic stamping of feet, the chanting that rises and falls like waves. The smell of smoke and barley brew clings to your clothes, mixing with the musky scent of a crowded hall. When the voices fall silent, the quiet is so complete that you can hear your own pulse. And then, the humor of the moment seeps in. Imagine standing there, promised cosmic revelations, only to find yourself distracted by the person next to you breathing too loudly. It's a universal truth. No matter how sacred the moment, someone always ruins the atmosphere by sneezing. Still, as the chants resume, the experience feels less about individual annoyance and more about collective awe. You can sense why thousands sought initiation year after year. To be here was to feel part of something larger, to step into a mystery that blurred the line between gods and mortals. Death and life, silence and song. The night stretches onward. Torches burning lower, the air growing warmer. You step back into the cool air of the olive grove, where the stars sprawl across the sky like an endless scroll. The mystery remains unspoken, sealed away by centuries of silence. But you carry its shadow with you, a reminder that history's secrets often linger not in what is revealed, but in what is carefully, deliberately withheld. You leave the olive groves behind and find yourself among the stone and dust of Sparta, where the night air smells faintly of sweat, iron, and olive oil rubbed onto skin after endless hours of training. The city feels quieter than Athens, sterner too. No crowded theaters here, no bustling philosophers' debates. Instead, you hear the clatter of weapons, the occasional bark of orders, and the low murmur of voices in a mess hall where warriors eat side by side. Sparta was famous for discipline, and here, even intimacy was woven into the fabric of training and loyalty. The mainstream fact is clear. Spartan culture deliberately cultivated close bonds among its male citizens, believing these relationships strengthened military cohesion. Young men were often paired with older mentors in a system designed not only to train but to bind warriors with loyalty stronger than iron. To the Spartans, this was less about romance and more about ensuring that, on the battlefield, no man would abandon his companion. Loyalty, after all, is easier to command when affection is already there. The quirky tidbit. Some sources suggest Spartan training camps encouraged what today might look suspiciously like sleepover rules, but stricter. Boys were expected to sneak food to survive, sleep on reeds they had to gather themselves, and yes, sometimes form bonds under those shared hardships. One ancient writer dryly remarked that if the boys didn't grow stronger, at least they'd grow sneakier. Imagine a world where your homework assignment was steal cheese without being caught. Not the easiest syllabus. Historians still argue whether these Spartan pairings included ceremonial or ritualized sexual elements, or whether they were more symbolic bonds of mentorship and loyalty. Some argue for ritual intimacy as part of initiation. Others say the focus was purely military, with later gossip exaggerating the details. The debate is made murkier by outsiders, like Athenian writers, who love to paint Spartans as both admirable and suspiciously strange. You picture yourself slipping into one of the Spartan dining halls. The firelight glows against bronze helmets hung neatly on walls, and the air smells of barley broth, famous for being nutritious but utterly bland. Rows of young men sit cross-legged, their chatter low, punctuated by bursts of laughter, quickly shushed by older warriors. Someone tells a joke at the expense of Athens, and you realize even Spartan solemnity cracked under humor now and then. The rituals of bond forging weren't held in grand temples, but in these everyday spaces. Mess halls, training yards, campsites beneath the stars. You hear the rhythm of marching feet outside, a sound like thunder on packed earth. Within this context, intimacy was a tool of the state, ensuring the warrior class thought of themselves not as individuals, but as living pieces of the phalanx, each shield overlapping, each life bound to another. And here's where you can't resist the gentle sarcasm. Imagine telling a modern teenager that their civic duty required them to train endlessly, eat gruel every night, and sleep on reeds with no blankets. You'd probably get more rebellion than loyalty. The Spartans, though, saw this hardship as sharpening steel. The torchlight flickers, and you picture two warriors clasping hands, not in romance as much as in a vow, to protect each other, to protect the city, to live and die as one. The murmurs of the hall fade, and you step outside again, where the stars hang cold and bright above the rugged hills. Sparta feels both austere and strangely intimate. A city where whispered bonds were not hidden scandals, but celebrated tools of survival. You walk away from the fire-lit mess hall, hearing only the distant echo of shields striking in rhythm, a heartbeat of discipline. And you realize, even here, in a place that prided itself on hardness and simplicity, history tucked away its quiet, secret rites. Rites not of scandal, but of loyalty, dressed in whispers. You step away from Sparta's harsh hills and sail across the wine-dark sea, arriving at Crete under a moonlit sky. The air here is softer, perfumed by the faint sweetness of figs and the salty tang drifting off the harbor. Ahead rise the palatial ruins of Knossos, labyrinthine in their twists and turns, their painted walls glowing faintly in the torchlight. You wander into a courtyard where shadows dance against frescoes of bull leapers and dancers, and tonight, the silence hums with the memory of torchlit midnight rites. The mainstream fact is this: the Minoans, flourishing on Crete during the Bronze Age, are known for their elaborate palaces and ritual processions. Archaeologists point to the central courts of Knossos and Phaistos as sites for ceremonial dances, feasts and offerings tied to fertility and seasonal renewal. These weren't small gatherings. They could involve whole communities, masked performers, and processions carrying sacred objects through winding corridors. Now for the quirky tidbit, frescoes suggest that dancers sometimes wore elaborate costumes with flounced skirts and bare chests, while masks may have exaggerated features to the point of caricature. Imagine standing in the crowd, trying to maintain reverence, while watching someone dance energetically in what looks like the ancient Mediterranean's version of a feathered party outfit. The solemnity of the rite might have clashed with the barely suppressed giggles of onlookers. Historians still argue whether the Minoan midnight processions were purely celebratory, or whether they carried deeper, more secretive elements. Some scholars suggest they enacted myths of divine unions, perhaps even echoing the story of the sacred marriage between a priest-king and a goddess. Others remain cautious, arguing that what looks sensual in art might have been symbolic performances of agricultural fertility. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between pigment and imagination. You walk slowly across the flagstones of the court, their edges worn smooth. Torches line the walls, their flames fluttering as if nervous. The dancers appear in your mind's eye, men and women weaving together in spirals, hands raised, feet stamping a rhythm that pulses through the night air. Masks hide their expressions, but their movements are precise, practiced, ritualistic. You sense both joy and tension, like watching a performance that is at once sacred theater and cosmic invocation. The music would have been hypnotic, lyres plucked in steady patterns, drums beating like heartbeats, and flutes weaving through the darkness. The sound echoes in your chest as if the palace itself is humming. You can almost taste the wine that must have flowed, spiced and heavy, handed around in clay cups that smelled faintly of earth. And here comes the gentle sarcasm. If you were invited into one of these rituals, with your modern clumsiness, you'd likely trip over your own sandals halfway through the dance. The mask would slip, the torch would wobble, and suddenly you'd be remembered in myth not as a sacred initiate, but as that one who ruined the spiral. Yet for the Minoans, there was nothing clumsy about these nights. Every step of the dancers mirrored the cycles of the moon, the tides, the endless return of seasons. The labyrinthine corridors symbolized descent and return, life and death, the weaving together of chaos into order. What you witness is not scandal or spectacle, but reassurance that the earth would remain fertile, that communities would survive, that the gods had not turned their faces away. You step back, Leaving the court, and the frescoes seem to glow more brightly for a moment, as if the dancers are still there, caught in perpetual motion. The night air cools your skin, carrying the scent of olives and the distant sea. Behind you, the palace of Knossos stands like a sleeping giant, its painted chambers still whispering the secrets of torchlight dances, where masks, music, and mystery once blurred the line between human joy and divine necessity. You travel northward now across the Adriatic, into the lands of the Etruscans, an ancient people often overshadowed by their more famous Roman neighbors, yet whose customs left indelible marks on Mediterranean life. The Etruscan hills roll with vineyards and olive groves, but tonight the focus is not on wine or oil, it is on music, and on the curious habit of filling tombs with painted parties that looked livelier than many banquets of the living. The mainstream fact is this: Etruscan tombs from Tarquinia and Cerveteri are famously decorated with frescoes of musicians, dancers, and feasts. Archaeologists believe these images represented either the afterlife itself or rituals performed for the dead. The Etruscans believed in honoring ancestors with celebrations, not merely solemn mourning. The tombs became places where family members gathered, sang, danced, and ensured the dead felt included. Inscriptions sometimes mentioned lavish games or contests funded in a deceased person's honor, so funerals could resemble festivals more than somber farewells. Now for the quirky tidbit. One particularly lively tomb painting shows a flute player beside a man performing what can only be described as a wobbly handstand. Yes, an upside-down acrobat entertaining the departed. Imagine attending your uncle's funeral, only to watch someone balancing on their head while blowing into a double reed pipe. It's hard not to wonder whether the mourners were genuinely solemn or barely containing laughter at the sheer strangeness of it all. Scholars debate whether these images are literal depictions of funerary entertainment or symbolic visions of eternal joy. Some argue that acrobats and dancers were indeed hired for funerals, providing a kind of spectacle that honored both the dead and the living. Others suggest the murals functioned more as hopeful messages, promises that the afterlife would be full of music and delight. The consensus remains elusive, though the persistence of such images suggests a culture that embraced celebration alongside grief. You stand at the entrance of one such tomb, ducking into the cool darkness. The air smells faintly of damp stone and soil, but ahead, the walls flicker in lamplight, revealing painted figures frozen mid-gesture. A woman claps her hands in rhythm, while a man strums a lyre with delicate precision. Another raises a cup in salute, his eternal toast preserved in pigment. It feels less like death and more like stepping into a party paused in time. The Etruscans were skilled with bronze instruments, trumpets and curved horns used in both ceremonies and games. Their double flutes, the tibiae, could produce harmonies that echoed eerily in underground spaces. You imagine the sound reverberating through the tomb, filling it with a strange mix of cheer and melancholy, as if the dead themselves were swaying to the music. Here comes the gentle sarcasm. If you tried to play one of those ancient flutes now, the effect would likely be less celestial and more like a squeaky toy gone rogue. One wrong note in a tomb chamber and you'd have the ancestors rolling their spectral eyes, muttering that some traditions are best left in the past. Yet for the Etruscans, the music and feasts inside these tombs served a profound purpose. By recreating the joys of life in art, they ensured the dead remained part of the community. To live was to feast, to dance, to laugh, and to die was not to be cut off from those rhythms, but to continue them painted on walls, echoed in ritual. You linger, taking in the stillness of the painted banquet, where ancient musicians never tire and acrobats never stumble. The figures smile faintly, as though they know their role is not to frighten, but to comfort. You step back into the night air, stars gleaming above the Italian hills, and for a moment the distant sounds of laughter and song seem to float on the breeze, remnants of funerals that were anything but boring. You keep drifting further across time, now standing in the shadow of the mighty Parthenon, where the Athenians prided themselves on festivals that blurred the line between devotion and revelry. Tonight's subject, the Eleusinian Mysteries, those secret rites held in honor of Demeter and Persephone, whispered about across the Greek world and never fully explained in writing, because initiates were sworn to silence. The mainstream fact is straightforward enough. The Eleusinian Mysteries were among the most important religious ceremonies in ancient Greece, running for centuries from the 7th century BCE until well into the Roman period. Citizens and even emperors traveled to be initiated, seeking promises of a blessed afterlife. The rituals took place annually at Eleusis, near Athens, with participants walking in solemn procession along the sacred way, singing, dancing, and carrying sacred objects in preparation for secret rites inside the telesterion, a great hall built specifically for this purpose. Now for the quirky tidbit. Ancient sources hint at the peculiar foods involved in these ceremonies, one of which was a special drink called kaikion, a curious mix of barley, water, and mint. Not exactly a cocktail to win over a Michelin star, but it held ritual importance, symbolizing both simplicity and renewal. Some fringe scholars have even suggested that the barley was laced with ergot, a fungus that can cause hallucinations. If true, that would explain why so many initiates described seeing visions of divine light and otherworldly beings. Whether that's genuine spirituality or just the ancient version of a psychedelic smoothie is still hotly debated, and here lies the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the mysteries contained literal reenactments of Persephone's descent and return, or whether the central revelation was more abstract, a sacred object displayed, perhaps a sheaf of wheat symbolizing life and rebirth. Some insist there were elaborate dramatic performances. Others say it was the intensity of the collective atmosphere, torches, chanting, fasting, and sudden illumination that created a transformative psychological effect. The secrecy was so well kept that even now, we cannot be certain what the initiates actually saw. Imagine yourself joining the torchlit procession along the dusty road from Athens to Eleusis. The smell of burning resin fills the night air, and the chanting of thousands of voices echoes against the hills. You've been fasting for days, your stomach aching, but there's an almost electric anticipation in the air. People around you whisper about Persephone's return, about mysteries too sacred for casual talk. The moon rises, silvering the olive groves, and for a moment you feel as though the goddess herself is walking among you. The telesterion itself, once you step inside, is vast and dim. Torches cast long shadows across stone columns and the crowd grows hushed. Priests move silently with vessels and bundles, their movements deliberate, rehearsed, yet still charged with a gravity that keeps you alert. Then comes a sudden blaze of light, torches raised, voices lifted, a collective gasp that sweeps through the hall like a wave. Whatever you've witnessed, whether symbolic object or divine apparition, you know it's something you're not supposed to speak of, even if you could. And here's where the cheeky aside slides in. Imagine the frustration of modern historians, who would give anything for just one Athenian gossip willing to break the oath and spill the beans. Instead, all we get are tantalizing half-hints, like the world's most frustrating teaser trailer that never releases the full film. What made these mysteries so powerful was not just the ritual, but the community of secrecy. You were bound together with thousands of others by an experience that no outsider could share. That sense of exclusivity, of belonging to an inner circle, is powerful in any age. It meant you carried not just a story, but a transformation through the rest of your life. As you leave Eleusis, dawn breaking over the Aegean, you carry with you not just fatigue from the fasting and the chanting, but the quiet comfort of believing you've glimpsed something eternal. For the Athenians, these rites were not a curiosity. They were a promise, a reassurance that death was not the end, but merely another stage in a cycle as old as Persephone herself. You wander now across the Aegean, landing in the island world of Crete, where the Minoans, long before classical Athens or Rome, built labyrinthine palaces filled with frescoes of bulls, dancers, and gods. The sea laps against harbors busy with trade, but your focus tonight is on their peculiar fertility festivals. Rites so old and layered with myth that even the ancients themselves struggled to explain them. The mainstream fact is clear. The Minoans celebrated rituals tied to the cycles of nature, particularly the renewal of crops and the fertility of animals and humans alike. Archaeological evidence from Knossos, Phaistos, and other palace complexes reveals open-air courtyards and ceremonial platforms where such rites likely unfolded. Women played central roles. Priestesses are depicted in frescoes holding snakes, raising their arms in gestures of power, or standing beside sacred horns. Unlike later patriarchal societies, Minoan religion seems to have been dominated by female divinity and leadership. For the quirky tidbit, we turn to one particularly vivid set of images, acrobats leaping over charging bulls in a ritual known as bull leaping. It's one thing to pour wine and light incense. It's another to vault headfirst over the horns of a massive snorting animal. Some scholars believe this was a symbolic act of renewal and bravery, literally risking life in service to fertility gods. You picture the scene, drums pounding, spectators clapping, and some poor teenager saying, "Wait, you want me to do what again?" Historians still argue whether these events were purely symbolic spectacles, or if they had deeper sacrificial undertones. Was the bull the offering? Was the human leper the offering, expected to survive or die as fate allowed? Or was it all ritualized sport, much like modern extreme stunts intended to thrill and unify the community? The debate is ongoing, with interpretation swinging between solemn devotion and festive daredevilry. You step into a Minoan courtyard, the sun blazing overhead. The smell of olive oil lamps and crushed herbs fills the air, and the crowd surges with anticipation. Musicians play pipes and drums, creating a rhythm that rattles in your chest. Out comes the bull, massive and muscled, hooves striking the stone with an ominous thud. The acrobat steps forward, painted with bright colors, their hair braided and tied back, body gleaming with oil. With one fluid motion, they grasp the bull's horns, vault, and flip over its back. For a moment, the entire audience gasps, suspended between fear and awe. And here's your modern aside. Try explaining this as a safe team-building exercise at your office retreat. Don't worry, everyone, it's perfectly symbolic. Just jump over that angry animal with knives for horns and land gracefully in front of your boss. Human resources would file a complaint before you even touched the arena sand, the Minoan connection between fertility and spectacle extended beyond bulls. Offerings of grain, wine, and honey were made to goddesses, often poured into stone libation tables carved with double axes, the labries, a symbol still shrouded in layers of mystery. In some cases, figurines of women with exposed breasts holding snakes were placed on altars, suggesting a celebration of both life-giving power and protective energy. The island air feels alive with the sense that everything, the earth, the sea, the animals, the people, is part of one great cycle. To leap the bull was not simply sport, but a statement that life is precarious, that courage is needed to coax fertility from the land, and that ritual can turn danger into renewal. As you leave the palace, the sea breeze carries the tang of salt and thyme, and the echoes of drums seem to follow you down the winding stone steps. The Minoans are long gone, their scripts undeciphered, their gods unnamed, but the memory of their rites lingers, half history, half myth, like the shadow of a bull vaulting eternally into the Mediterranean sun. You drift eastward now, carried by desert winds into the ancient land of Egypt, where rituals were woven into daily life as seamlessly as the Nile's yearly flood. The temples rise before you, their colossal pylons catching the sun, hieroglyphs marching in endless lines across the sandstone. Tonight's tale is about the pharaoh's sacred fertility rites, ceremonies both public and hidden, designed to ensure that the kingdom itself continued to thrive like the black soil after inundation. The mainstream fact is this: the Sed festival, or Hebsed, was one of Egypt's most enduring rituals. Held typically after 30 years of a pharaoh's reign, it was a jubilee of renewal, reaffirming the ruler's vitality and divine right to govern. The pharaoh would run a ritual course, often depicted on temple walls, symbolizing vigor and the ability to sustain Egypt for years to come. This physical performance was not just exercise, it was political theater, a public assurance that the cosmic order, Ma'at, was still intact. Now for the quirky tidbit, some sources suggest the king's physical virility was also ritually linked to the land's fertility. There are inscriptions and myths hinting that symbolic acts, sometimes bordering on the risque, were tied to ensuring the Nile continued to flood and crops continued to grow. One particularly eyebrow-raising tradition comes from Heliopolis, where it was believed that Atum, the creator god, brought the world into being through a solitary act of self-fertilization. Priests of later generations may have reenacted elements of this myth to honor creation. Yes, in ways that are perhaps best left politely vague when giving a school field trip. Tour. Historians still argue whether pharaohs themselves participated in such fertility enactments or if it was the priests who bore that responsibility in mythic drama. Some suggest the said festival was purely athletic and symbolic, while others lean toward the idea that private rites, performed behind the sanctuary walls, invoked the raw sexual energy of gods like Min, the ithyphallic deity of fertility. To this day, the exact boundaries between solemn state ritual and sacred intimacy remain blurred. You imagine yourself in the court of Karnak, drums pounding, trumpets blaring as the pharaoh, adorned in gleaming white linen, sprints along the ritual track. The crowd erupts in cheers at the sight of their ruler, demonstrating not only physical stamina, but divine blessing. The air smells of lotus blossoms and incense, while dancers whirl with sistrums, their bronze rattles shimmering in the sunlight. The people see renewal not only for their ruler, but for themselves. Then you step behind the towering columns, away from the public spectacle, into the dim sanctuary where priests conduct quieter, stranger ceremonies. Offerings of bread, beer, and lotus wine are placed on polished stone altars. Hymns rise in low, rhythmic tones, invoking gods whose powers are more sensual than warlike. The god Min stands depicted on the wall, his rigid form a reminder that life springs from generative force as much as from divine order. Cue the modern aside. Imagine if political leaders today had to prove their legitimacy not just with debates or campaign ads, but by jogging a marathon at 70 years old, followed by some fertility reenactment behind closed doors. The approval ratings would collapse faster than you could say sacred onion garlands. Yet, in Egypt, such rites mattered. The king was the axis between the divine and the earthly. His strength, virility, and fertility mirrored the health of the Nile itself. To fail in these rituals was to risk cosmic imbalance. To succeed was to assure Egyptians that grain would rise tall, cattle would calve, and the sun itself would continue its dependable journey across the sky. As you step back out into the blazing sun, temple walls glow with scenes of running pharaohs and offerings made to Min. The chants echo faintly in your ears, and for a fleeting moment you sense the strange mix of solemn devotion and sly humor that underpinned these ceremonies. The Egyptians, after all, could enshrine both the cosmic and the carnal in the same breath, binding them together in ritual that kept the world turning. You cross deserts and mountains now, wandering into the land of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates carved fertile crescents of mud and grain, and where kings ruled by divine right that had to be ritually renewed every year. The air is hot, thick with the smell of barley, beer, and burnt offerings, and in the distance you hear the beat of drums echoing across temple courtyards. Tonight the focus is on the sacred marriage rite, a ceremony that brought together king and goddess in symbolic union. The mainstream fact is this: the sacred marriage, or hieros gamos, was a key element of Sumerian and later Babylonian ritual. At New Year festivals, the king would represent Dumuzi, the shepherd god, while the high priestess stood as Inanna, goddess of love and fertility. Their symbolic union, performed in the temple, was believed to ensure agricultural abundance, political stability, and the well-being of the city for the coming year. Texts from Uruk and Ur describe hymns sung to celebrate this mystical wedding, with lines that blur the line between religious devotion and romantic poetry. The quirky tidbit is harder to miss. Some of these hymns are surprisingly steamy for ancient liturgy. Phrases about honeyed kisses, milk-sweet embraces, and plowing the sacred field leave little to the imagination. It's hard not to picture scribes snickering as they carefully etch these sultry metaphors into clay tablets. The rite itself may have been enacted with bread, beer, and symbolic gestures, or, as some sources imply, with far less symbolic restraint. Historians still argue whether the union was an actual physical act performed by king and priestess, or a purely ceremonial reenactment accompanied by music, offerings, and recitations. Some scholars point to hymns that sound deeply personal, as though a real intimate act was involved, while others argue it was theatrical, with gestures standing in for consummation. The debate remains unresolved, lingering somewhere between sacred drama and royal honeymoon. You find yourself standing at the foot of a ziggurat, its steps towering above you, glowing orange in the lamplight. The crowd presses close, waiting for the rites to begin. Priests bring offerings of dates, figs, and beer, while musicians tune lyres and flutes. The scent of incense and roasted lamb drifts through the night air. A hush falls as the king enters, clad in shining garments, his face painted for the occasion. The high priestess follows, veiled and resplendent, her voice rising in a chant that carries across the courtyard. Inside the temple, oil lamps flicker as hymns are sung, their words praising Inanna's beauty and Dumuzi's vigor. The congregation outside joins in the refrains, voices swelling like waves of the Euphrates. Whether or not the union is literal, the effect is communal. The city feels its fields will yield, its flocks will multiply, its rulers will remain in divine favor. Here's your cheeky aside. Imagine if modern heads of state had to act out their country's fertility in front of thousands of people each spring. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the President and the First High Priestess for tonight's live symbolic wedding performance. The ratings would break the internet, but the approval polls might never recover. Yet for Mesopotamians, this blending of intimacy and politics was essential. To separate the fertility of the land from the fertility of the body would have seemed absurd. The king's role was not just administrative. He was the living bridge between gods and humans, and his ability to unite with the goddess was a guarantee that the cycle of life itself would not falter. When the hymns fade and the offerings have been consumed, the city celebrates. Drums thunder, dancers whirl in the torchlight, and beer flows freely in clay mugs. You step back into the night, the ziggurat silhouetted against a starry sky, and you realize that here in the cradle of civilization, the idea of a wedding was never just about two people. It was about binding heaven and earth together in a rite older than writing itself. You drift now toward the Indus Valley and onward into the great Indian subcontinent, where rituals blend seamlessly with the rhythms of the seasons and the verses of sacred hymns. Temples rise from jungled plains, carved in stone with gods and dancers frozen mid-motion. Tonight's path leads you into the world of Vedic fertility ceremonies. Rites sung in Sanskrit long before temples of marble stood. The mainstream fact is this: the Rig Veda, composed around 1500–1200 BCE, preserves hymns that were recited in fertility rituals linked to agriculture, rain, and human prosperity. Sacrifices of ghee, milk, and soma, the mysterious, intoxicating ritual drink, were poured into fire while priests chanted verses calling on deities such as Indra, Agni, and Ushas. These ceremonies were not fringe, they were the backbone of Vedic life, binding cosmic order, RTA, to the daily needs of crops, cattle, and children. For the quirky tidbit, some hymns describe rituals in startlingly intimate language, where plowing the field is compared directly to sexual union. The earth is addressed as a bride, the plow as her husband, and the seeds as their offspring. Imagine standing in a field while a priest chants, "May the furrow be fruitful," like a well-beloved woman. It's agricultural poetry that would make even your high school biology teacher blush. And here lies the scholarly debate. Historians still argue about the nature of soma. Was it a hallucinogenic mushroom, a mountain shrub, or a carefully brewed mixture of herbs? Ancient hymns describe it as a divine elixir that filled worshippers with light, power, and visions. Some claim it was entirely symbolic, while others insist its psychoactive punch was central to the transformative power of the rite. The mystery lingers unsolved, like an ancient recipe locked behind temple doors. Picture yourself at a Vedic fire altar, the night sky wheeling with stars overhead. Priests with shaven heads and ochre robes chant in rhythmic cadences, their voices rising and falling like waves. Ghee hisses as it hits the flames, sending fragrant smoke spiraling upward. The air is thick with the tang of soma, earthy and sharp, poured from a vessel into ceremonial cups. Drums beat softly in the distance, keeping time with the chant. At the edge of the fields, farmers join in the ritual, hands pressed together in prayer. The furrows lie waiting, dark and damp from irrigation, and in the flickering firelight the soil seems almost alive. Seeds are scattered with solemn gestures, while priests call upon the gods to bless every stalk of grain, every calf, every human womb. To them, fertility is not just a biological matter. It is cosmic order embodied in flesh and soil alike. Here's your modern aside. Imagine if today's farmers had to chant Vedic hymns and down hallucinogenic smoothies before operating their tractors. Crop yields might rise, or maybe just the number of confused cows watching as humans start philosophizing about the meaning of irrigation. The night deepens, but the ritual continues. Offerings of milk, honey, and grains are fed to the fire, while the priests declare that heaven and earth are united through sacrifice. The hymns echo across the fields, ancient voices weaving together human effort, divine blessing, and the sensual imagery of soil as bride. When dawn finally comes, the first light falls on freshly seeded fields, and the smoke of the altar drifts upward in thin, fading ribbons. You step away, carrying with you the sense that here, in the heart of Vedic India, fertility was not a private act, but a cosmic covenant, sealed with chant, flame, and the taste of soma on the tongue. You step now into the fragrant air of ancient Anatolia, where the Hittites ruled with iron will and complex rituals that blended politics, gods, and fertility in ways that still puzzle scholars. Their stone fortresses and sprawling temples stand amid dry hills, the wind carrying whispers of chants once sung to deities whose names are only half remembered. Tonight's focus is the sacred rites of the storm god Tarhunt and the mother goddess Hebat, ceremonies that kept both the skies and the wombs fertile. The mainstream fact is this: Hittite kings often performed public rituals to ensure the fertility of the land, the abundance of grain, and the health of livestock. Inscriptions detail offerings of bread, honey, and sheep, along with processions that carried sacred statues of the gods through city gates and out into fields. The king himself was central to these acts, embodying the role of mediator between divine and human realms, ensuring rain would fall and crops would flourish. Now for the quirky tidbit: one Hittite fertility ritual included the curious use of bread dough shaped like body parts. Yes, literal loaves molded into symbolic forms. These were offered to the gods, sometimes anointed with oils, as if to feed the divine with the promise of human fertility. It's a surreal image, priests solemnly holding up bread shaped like ears, hands, or other less mentionable anatomy, while chanting for blessing. Imagine wandering into that ceremony and trying not to laugh at the world's strangest bakery. Here's where historians still argue: were these rituals symbolic stand-ins? Or were some rites carried out with more embodied enactments of union between priest and priestess, mirroring myths of divine coupling? Some tablets hint at dramatic performances of gods uniting to renew the earth. Others suggest the symbolism stayed within gestures and offerings, never tipping into literal intimacy. The scholarly camp remains divided, the clay tablets often fragmentary, their meanings tantalizing but incomplete. You picture the scene in Hattusa, the Hittite capital. The massive city gates loom behind you, carved with lions and sphinxes, while priests in embroidered robes march solemnly through the streets. The people press close, tossing grain and petals as offerings. At the center, a cart carries the statue of the storm god, his face stern, his hand raised in a gesture of power. The air smells of roasted lamb and burning juniper, thick with anticipation. Later, in the sanctuary, the king and queen preside over offerings of wine, oil, and shaped bread. Hymns rise in the guttural Hittite tongue, voices layered and hypnotic. Priests wave cedar branches, sprinkling water in imitation of rain. Outside, farmers kneel in the dirt, holding seeds in their palms, waiting for the blessing to fall so they may sow the fields. The connection is clear. Divine fertility equals human survival. Cue the modern aside. Imagine a State of the Union address where, instead of presenting economic forecasts, the leader solemnly bakes bread shaped like body parts, assuring citizens that prosperity is on the way. Cable news would need a whole new set of anchors just to process the visuals. Yet in the Hittite mind, such rites were logical. Bread was life, shaped to reflect life's sources. Rain was not just weather, but a gift tied to the fertility of gods and kings. To act out these connections was to weave the fabric of cosmic balance, ensuring fields sprouted, herds multiplied, and the people endured another year. As night falls over Anatolia, the rituals close with feasting, dancing, and the low hum of pipes and drums. The king retreats to his palace, the farmers to their homes, but the scent of sacred bread and the echo of chants linger in the cool evening air. You walk away slowly, imagining loaves shaped like symbols of life offered to gods older than memory itself. You turn next toward the rugged landscapes of the Andean highlands, where the Inca civilization once stretched across mountains and valleys, binding people together with stone roads and sacred rituals. High above the clouds, in temples of gold and granite, priests of the sun god Inti performed ceremonies that fused agriculture, astronomy, and the pulse of empire into one continuous rhythm. Tonight's theme is fertility, not only of fields and wombs, but of the very cosmos, with rituals designed to keep the sun rising and the earth generous. The mainstream fact is clear. The Inca held elaborate fertility rites tied to the agricultural calendar, most famously during Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun. This ceremony marked the winter solstice in the southern hemisphere and ensured that the sun would return stronger, lengthening the days and reviving the crops. Offerings of maize, coca leaves, chicha beer, and llamas were presented, their sacrifice and symbolism binding human effort to divine favor. Without these rites, it was feared the balance between heaven and earth might falter. Here's the quirky tidbit. During certain rituals, priests chewed massive amounts of coca leaves, using the numbing and stimulating effects to enter trance states. Imagine a line of dignified, robe-clad holy men with green-stained teeth, their mouths bulging with wads of coca, chanting prayers while swaying in rhythm. The leaves were not just sacred but practical, allowing them to endure long ceremonies at dizzying altitudes without fainting from lack of oxygen. The divine, it seems, often required a little chemical assistance. Now, the scholarly debate. Some chronicles from Spanish conquistadors describe human sacrifice as part of these fertility rites, particularly the offering of children known as capacocha. These were not haphazard slayings, but carefully chosen, ritually prepared children believed to ascend into divine guardianship, ensuring fertility of land and people. Modern archaeologists have found mummified remains in icy mountain shrines, their bodies astonishingly preserved, evidence of ritual rather than massacre. Yet scholars remain divided on how widespread these sacrifices were. Were they central to fertility rites, or rare acts reserved for moments of crisis? You imagine standing at Cusco's Coricancha temple, the golden enclosure, where walls once glowed with sheets of hammered gold, dedicated to Inti. The emperor himself, considered the son of the sun, presided over ceremonies, his garments shimmering with feathers and jewels. Crowds filled the plaza, bearing offerings of woven cloth, llamas, and jars of maize beer. The air was thin but charged, drums echoing against the mountains. Priests raised golden cups toward the sky, chanting to draw back the sun's strength. Later, processions carried effigies of gods and ancestors through the streets. Farmers held seeds in their hands, waiting for the symbolic blessing before planting. Women wove garments during the ceremonies, their threads seen as binding the fertility of the cosmos into human work. The entire empire, from valley villages to mountaintop shrines, was synchronized through ritual, every act reinforcing that humans were not separate from nature but partners in its cycles. Pause for the modern aside. Imagine if today's agricultural ministries required every farmer to attend a solstice festival, chanting and drinking until dawn, their subsidies dependent on how convincingly they could wave seeds at the rising sun. It would make farm reports far livelier, though one can picture the puzzled faces of international observers. Still, for the Incas, these rites were serious business. The fertility of potatoes, maize, and quinoa was directly tied to the power of the gods. The balance of cosmos, community, and soil rested on precise offerings, solemn chants, and at times, costly sacrifices. To skip such ceremonies was unthinkable. The survival of the empire depended on weaving the sun back into its cycle. Night settles over the Andes, and you picture fires flickering against mountain peaks, their smoke spiraling toward constellations that the Inca read as celestial animals guiding planting and harvest. The last echoes of panpipes fade, but the certainty remains. Through ritual, the Inca bound the fertility of the earth to the shining face of the sun, ensuring another cycle of life in the highlands. You descend now into the fragrant, spice-laden air of the Indian subcontinent, where ancient Hindu rituals intertwined fertility with cosmic order. Here, sexuality was not a shadowy topic, but a celebrated force woven into religion, art, and daily life. In temple courtyards carved with gods locked in eternal embraces, you find ceremonies designed to honor fertility, not just of people, but of rivers, cattle, and the earth itself. The mainstream fact is well established. Vedic traditions tied fertility rites to the rhythms of sacrifice, prayer, and seasonal festivals. The Ashvamedha, or horse sacrifice, while primarily a political ritual, contained elements symbolizing renewal and fertility of the kingdom. Later, fertility worship expanded into temple rituals honoring deities like Shiva, whose lingam represented both generative energy and cosmic balance. Women and men alike prayed for children, abundant harvests, and prosperity. with priests conducting offerings of ghee, grains, and flowers into fire altars that blazed as links between earth and heaven. Now for the quirky tidbit. In some villages, fertility ceremonies involved carrying clay or wooden phallic symbols through town, decorating them with garlands and even playfully bathing them in milk or honey. Imagine your local neighborhood association planning such a parade, balloons, streamers, and a very large clay phallus on a cart rolled down the main street while elders clap along. Ancient ritual or viral social media moment? You decide. Here's where historians scratch their heads. Debates continue over how literally sexual practices were incorporated into fertility rites. The tantric tradition, for example, is famous for its esoteric rituals involving controlled intimacy as a path to spiritual enlightenment. But were these widespread practices, or rare acts performed by select initiates? Some scholars argue that most tantric rituals were symbolic, with metaphors of union describing the merging of divine energies rather than literal bedroom reenactments. Others insist that at least in certain sects, ritual intimacy was central, intended to harness physical pleasure for cosmic renewal. Historians still argue whether what you see carved on temple walls was daily practice or aspirational artwork. You picture the temples of Khajuraho, their sandstone walls alive with thousands of figures, dancers, musicians, and lovers entwined in impossible poses. These were not secretive, but proudly public. Decorating sacred architecture meant to inspire awe and reverence. To step into such a temple was to step into a worldview where fertility and pleasure were not sins but sacred pathways. Priests explained that just as rain fertilizes earth, human union mirrored cosmic creativity. During spring festivals like Holi, fertility themes burst into the open. People smeared each other with colors, drank sweetened drinks, and sang ribald songs celebrating renewal. Married women prayed for healthy children, unmarried ones for good matches. Fires were lit, symbolizing the destruction of sterility and the rebirth of fertility in all forms. The air smelled of flowers, spices, and smoke, as laughter mixed with prayer. And now the modern aside. Imagine if your office HR department mandated an annual fertility festival, requiring employees to smear neon powders on each other, chant blessings for corporate prosperity, and toss around symbols of cosmic regeneration. Suddenly, those bland quarterly reports would look like confetti-splattered manifestos of joy. But in ancient India, fertility rites weren't quirky extras. They were central to sustaining society. The annual flooding of rivers, the health of cattle, and the continuation of dynasties were all tied to ceremonies affirming the generative power of the universe. Without ritual attention, people feared imbalance, drought, or decline. As night deepens, you imagine fire altars glowing in courtyards, priests chanting Sanskrit verses while sparks swirl into the sky. In nearby homes, women tie red threads around banyan trees asking for children. The scent of sandalwood smoke lingers. The drone of hymns vibrates in your chest, and the image of carved stone lovers flickers in torchlight. Fertility here is not hidden or ashamed. It is carved into walls, sung in festivals, and honored in flames. Now you drift toward the sunlit valleys of the Andes, where the Inca Empire stretched across mountains, rivers, and skies. Here, sexuality was woven into festivals of abundance and agriculture, each rite echoing the empire's deep reverence for Pachamama, the Earth Mother, and Inti, the sun god. Fertility wasn't a whispered matter in Inca life. It was a cosmic necessity, as vital as maize and llamas. The mainstream fact to anchor yourself. The Incas held fertility festivals timed with the agricultural calendar, especially during planting and harvest seasons. Priests led offerings of corn beer, coca leaves, and llamas, believing that human fertility was inseparably bound to the fertility of the soil. These festivals, often held in the great city of Cuzco, featured rituals of dancing, music, and symbolic acts meant to ensure bountiful crops and healthy families. The quirky tidbit: llama sacrifices weren't only about death. They were tied to fertility. Young white llamas were offered to Pachamama, but archaeologists have found that their reproductive organs were sometimes preserved, ritually buried, or even painted as symbols of abundance. Imagine a modern farmer being told to bless their tractor by decorating a plastic cow statue. Slightly odd, but symbolically powerful. And here comes the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the Incas' fertility festivals included ritualized sexual activity among the participants. Some Spanish chroniclers, always eager to portray Andean practices as scandalous, described nighttime revels where men and women mingled freely after ceremonies. But were these accounts exaggerated, products of missionary imagination? Or did certain festivals indeed allow ritualized intimacy as a mirror of the earth's fertility? Scholars are divided, with archaeological evidence proving hard to read. Was that ceremonial courtyard meant for ritual dances? Or was it a sacred lovers' gathering ground under starlight? The answer still drifts somewhere between stone walls and oral tradition. Picture the scene. The plaza of Cuzco alive with thousands of dancers, clad in bright woven tunics, feathers, and gold ornaments. Music rises from panpipes and drums. Priests pour libations of chicha beer onto the ground, whispering to the earth to drink deeply. A woman walks in circles carrying baskets of corn, while a man holds a staff carved with sun symbols. Their gestures mirror a cosmic dance, union of earth and sky, male and female, seed and soil. The humor sneaks in if you imagine the logistics. Someone had to organize all these offerings, track which llamas were available, and manage the festival catering of chicha beer. You can almost hear the ancient version of a festival coordinator sighing, "Who double-booked the Sun Temple courtyard? We can't have the maize ritual and the llama blessing at the same time." Still, the air is reverent. The Incas believed that by joining ritual with life, they maintained balance. Crops grew, children thrived, and the empire endured. If fertility faltered, drought or famine might follow, so these rituals carried real weight. You imagine yourself in that plaza at dusk. Fires glow against the darkening mountains, and the Milky Way stretches above, which the Incas called Mayu, the celestial river. Its constellations were shaped like animals, their stories tied to fertility and life. Perhaps you tilt your head, tracing a celestial llama above while hearing the echo of drums below. The same rhythms that pulse in bodies, in rivers, in the earth itself. By the time the festival wanes, people are tired, tipsy on corned beer, and full of songs. The sacred mingles with the everyday. Children tug at mothers' skirts, dogs bark at embers, and old men fall asleep against walls. Fertility has been celebrated in 100 forms tonight. Offerings, songs, dances, and maybe, just maybe, a few stolen embraces under the stars. Your steps carry you westward now, across oceans, until you arrive in the islands of Polynesia. Here, under palm trees and starlit skies, sexuality and fertility were not seen as secrets to be hidden, but as natural, vital parts of life. In these islands, the human body itself was sacred art, and the ceremonies surrounding fertility reflected that openness. The mainstream historical fact first. In many Polynesian cultures, fertility rituals were woven into broader religious and social life. Deities like Lono in Hawaii were associated with agriculture, rain, and procreation, and festivals such as the Makahiki celebrated abundance and renewal. These events involved offerings of food, song, and dance, especially the hula, which was originally a sacred performance connected to divine fertility and balance. The rituals ensured that crops, fishing, and family life remained in harmony with the gods. The quirky tidbit: some fertility rites involved symbolic games and contests where men and women openly flirted, sometimes through improvised chants filled with humorous or risque metaphors. One Hawaiian tradition describes men comparing the size of their taro plants as cheeky stand-ins for more personal measurements. Imagine the awkward modern equivalent at a neighborhood barbecue. "Hey, whose zucchini looks the most promising this year?" The laughter was part of the ritual, for humor itself was believed to attract divine favor and fertility. Now, to the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether ritualized intimacy was formally sanctioned during festivals, or if it simply occurred as part of the communal celebrations. Some early European explorers described Polynesian fertility rites with scandalized detail, claiming they observed open sexual expression as part of religious festivals. Yet later scholars suggest these accounts may have been colored by European discomfort, exaggeration, or misunderstanding. Were these truly sacred sexual acts, or did the explorers interpret joyful communal dances through their own biased lenses? The truth remains hazy, caught between oral traditions and outsider records. Picture it now, an evening in a Polynesian village, the air warm and scented with breadfruit roasting over fires. Drums beat softly, conch shells sound, and dancers move in fluid lines, hips swaying, hands gesturing stories of creation and love. The moon glimmers across the waves and the community gathers close, clapping, singing, laughing. You notice children weaving garlands of flowers while elders nod along, reminding everyone that fertility belongs to the cycle of generations. The atmosphere is not one of secrecy or shame, but of celebration. Life itself, from the ripening of coconuts to the swelling of expectant mothers, was honored with dance, rhythm, and humor. The sacred and the playful met in the same breath, each reinforcing the other. You imagine yourself there, bare feet in soft sand, drum beats pulsing in your chest, laughter in your ears. A young man improvises a chant, teasing his friend about his tiny canoe, and the crowd roars with delight. The gods, it is believed, enjoy laughter too, and their favor is drawn by joy, not solemn silence. As the night deepens, songs continue. Some are old, handed down for centuries, others invented in the moment. You see how fertility in Polynesia was not just about crops or children. It was about the vibrancy of the whole community, the rhythm of life itself, and the reassurance that tomorrow's sun would rise on full nets, healthy families and steady hearts. You wander now into the glittering halls of Versailles, that palace of mirrors and powdered wigs, where fertility rituals took on an entirely different character. Unlike the earthy offerings of farmers or the ecstatic dances of villagers, the French court's concern with reproduction was a matter of dynastic survival, political intrigue, and public performance. Here, fertility was not just sacred, it was staged. The mainstream fact is clear. In Bourbon France, especially under Louis XIV and Louis XV, the king's ability to produce heirs was treated as a matter of state. Court life revolved around ensuring that royal marriages were fertile, and rituals surrounded not just the wedding night, but the ongoing visibility of the king's private life. The famous phrase, "Le roi s'amuse," the king enjoys himself, wasn't just about leisure. It was also reassurance to the court, the church, and the people that the monarch was healthy, virile, and producing heirs. The quirky tidbit: royal beds at Versailles were not private sanctuaries, but semi-public stages. On a royal wedding night, courtiers crowded into the room to watch the newlyweds climb into bed together. Imagine your in-laws, co-workers, and half your LinkedIn connections gathered at the foot of your mattress, politely applauding your ability to tuck yourself in. It sounds absurd now, but it was deadly serious then, a visible act meant to seal dynastic alliances and reassure everyone that heirs would soon arrive. Historians still argue whether such ceremonies were symbolic performances or whether the public ritual sometimes extended into actual consummation before witnesses. Some suggest that the doors closed at a certain point, privacy restored, while others argue that records hint at a disturbingly literal interpretation. The truth remains debated. Was the audience simply checking the covers were drawn, or did they stay longer than modern comfort allows? Picture it now, the grand bedchamber at Versailles, walls covered in velvet, candles glowing against gilded panels. The air smells of wax and perfume, and courtiers whisper behind painted fans. Musicians strike a few soft notes as the king and queen enter, robed in ceremonial finery. A chamberlain announces them as though this were a theatrical play. You can almost hear the polite coughs, the rustle of skirts, the suppressed laughter as a noble drops his powdered wig in nervousness. And the tension is real. Without heirs, alliances collapse, factions plot, and the legitimacy of the monarchy trembles. The bed is not just furniture. It is a throne of sheets and down feathers, carrying the weight of a nation's future. Humor creeps in if you imagine your own bedroom with Versailles protocols applied. A crowd of neighbors assembling every night to observe whether you successfully demonstrate your vigor. Forget Netflix. Your entertainment would be the royal tuck-in ritual, streamed live. Breaking news. The duvet is properly adjusted. France shall endure another season. But for all its strangeness, these fertility rites reveal the anxieties of monarchy. Dynasties hinged on children, and children hinged on ritual, visibility, and belief. The king's private life was never truly his own. It belonged to the state, and by extension to history. As you drift in this scene, you imagine the whisper of silk gowns, the soft glow of candles, the heavy silence broken only by an occasional cough. The public performance ends, curtains are drawn, and the courtiers shuffle out, murmuring prayers for heirs. Outside, the fountains of Versailles still gush in rhythm, water flowing endlessly, as if echoing the eternal pressure for fertility at the very heart of the French crown. You slip now from gilded Versailles into the quieter, incense-filled palaces of the Ming dynasty, where imperial fertility carried its own peculiar blend of secrecy, bureaucracy, and ritual. In China, dynastic continuity was paramount. The emperor was the son of heaven, and his ability to produce heirs guaranteed cosmic order. The palace wasn't just a home. It was a vast machine designed to regulate intimacy in the service of stability. The mainstream fact stands out. In the Forbidden City, the emperor's nightly movements were tracked, recorded, and ritualized. The harem system included hundreds of concubines, but encounters were carefully scheduled. Imperial officials literally kept ledgers, noting which woman was chosen on which night, her rank, and the exact timing. This wasn't gossip, it was an administrative duty, meant to prevent favoritism and to ensure a steady supply of legitimate heirs. The quirky tidbit: a concubine selected for the emperor's bed was ceremonially presented to him in a bundle. No, really, she was stripped, wrapped in a quilt, and carried by eunuchs to the emperor's chamber like a royal burrito. Imagine trying to feel dignified while being delivered like a sushi roll, while palace scribes quietly noted the logistics. This bizarre presentation ritual was meant to eliminate any chance of intrigue, poisoning, or trickery, but it added a surreal, almost comedic touch to the night's proceedings. Here's where historians still argue. Some scholars claim the emperor's fertility rites were deeply entwined with Taoist practices, designed to channel his yang energy and preserve cosmic balance. Others insist these rituals were largely bureaucratic and political, with little spiritual depth beyond ensuring a lineage. Was intimacy with concubines really meant to harmonize heaven and earth, or was it just paperwork wrapped in silk? The debate continues. Imagine the atmosphere inside the Forbidden City on such a night. Lanterns flicker along endless red corridors. Eunuchs pad silently with shuffling steps, and somewhere in a hidden chamber, officials inscribe today's choices in ledgers that will outlast the lovers themselves. The air smells of sandalwood and ink, and the palace seems to hum with controlled anticipation. It's easy to find the humor if you picture the emperor, exhausted from meetings with ministers, suddenly confronted with an endless spreadsheet of concubines. Who's scheduled for Thursday again? It's bureaucracy meeting intimacy, and neither side looks particularly relaxed. But beneath the absurdity lies a serious truth. The empire's stability depended on heirs, and heirs depended on these rituals. A barren empress, a favored concubine, a missing son. Each ripple could shift the currents of history. As you linger in this imagined night, the palace becomes a strange blend of shadow and ceremony. The quilted concubine arrives, the ledgers are updated, the silence deepens. Outside, the city sleeps under moonlight, unaware that the empire's future is being shaped in a room lined with silk screens and guarded by men who were deliberately removed from the game of fertility themselves. The emperor's role as cosmic father was heavy, lonely, and oddly scripted. You picture him sighing, aware that every movement is noted, every embrace politicized. Fertility here was not playful or festive. It was managed like a tax record, enforced with ritual, and cloaked in secrecy that still leaves historians puzzling centuries later. You drift now into the stone-walled sanctuaries of medieval monasteries, where fertility rituals took a subtler, more paradoxical turn. At first glance, monks and nuns vowed to renounce sexuality entirely, dedicating their lives to prayer and discipline. Yet even here, where chastity was preached as the highest virtue, fertility slipped in through metaphor, allegory, and curious devotional practices. The mainstream fact: Christian theology in the Middle Ages often framed spiritual life in terms of fertility and reproduction. The Church celebrated the Virgin Mary as a figure of miraculous conception, and Christ himself was sometimes described as a divine seed planted in the souls of believers. Monks in cloisters copied texts and illuminated manuscripts with vines, flowers, and bursting fruits, symbols of spiritual abundance. Fertility became a metaphor for divine grace, flowing into those who remained faithful. Now for the quirky tidbit. Despite vows of celibacy, some monasteries collected relics thought to aid fertility for the laity. Pilgrims visited shrines where saints' bones or holy wells were believed to cure barrenness. In one abbey, women reportedly crawled under an altar stone associated with Saint Bridget to encourage conception. Imagine that, hundreds of hopeful couples lining up, treating the church like a medieval fertility clinic with candlelight and chanting monks as background music. Historians still argue whether whispers of secret rituals ever existed behind cloister walls. Some medieval critics accused monks and nuns of indulging in fertility rites disguised as devotion, parades of saints' relics, curious healing ceremonies involving herbs and oils, even dances around churchyards on feast days. Were these accusations real practices, or just slander from rivals eager to mock monastic hypocrisy? Scholars debate, since surviving records mix rumor, satire, and genuine observance. Picture yourself walking down a cold cloister corridor, your breath visible in the air. Candles flicker against damp stone, illuminating frescoes of vines curling across walls. You hear Gregorian chants echo through the chapel, their low notes like steady heartbeats. Yet between the solemn hymns you notice a procession of villagers clutching little charms, muttering prayers for children. A monk, straight-faced but tired, blesses loaves of bread said to improve fertility. And the humor? Imagine that monk later explaining to his abbot that the bread line is getting longer than Sunday Mass, and they may need to hire extra bakers just to meet demand. Medieval spirituality meets supply chain problem, but for those who believed, these rituals carried weight. A barren couple might travel days, risking bandits and blisters, just to kneel at a relic said to open wombs or strengthen seed. Whether or not the relic worked, the act gave hope, and hope itself was fertile ground. As the bells toll midnight, you feel the quiet of the monastery settle in. The cloister garden, dormant in winter, promises spring blooms. Monks sleep in cold cells, yet dream of vines and seeds, not for themselves, but for the souls they nurture. Fertility here has shifted, hidden, sublimated, turned into allegory, yet it pulses still, disguised beneath layers of stone, chant, and prayer. Now you step into the buzzing streets of Renaissance Italy, where fertility and art twined together in ways that blurred the sacred and the sensual. Here, fertility rituals weren't only hidden in monasteries or controlled by courts. They were painted on canvases, sung in poems, and performed in festivals that dazzled the senses. The mainstream fact: Renaissance Florence. Rome and Venice all hosted fertility festivals tied to both Catholic feasts and older folk customs. For example, during the May Day celebrations, young men and women decorated houses with greenery and flowers, symbols of renewal and fecundity. In Florence, the festival of Calendamaggio featured dancing, songs, and pageants filled with fertility imagery, while artists like Botticelli filled canvases with allegories of spring, love, and fruitfulness, his Primavera being one of the most famous. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some Renaissance families commissioned paintings of plump, naked babies called putti, not merely as decoration, but as talismans to encourage fertility in their households. These chubby little cupids were plastered on bedroom walls, carved into furniture, and even embroidered into bed linens. Imagine your modern friends commissioning a mural of cartoonish diaper-clad toddlers above their headboard to set the mood. Subtlety was not the Renaissance strong suit. Historians still argue about how literally Renaissance elites engaged in fertility rites beyond the art and festivals. Some documents hint at private rituals in aristocratic circles, feasts where fertility charms, herbs, and aphrodisiacs were shared in the name of ensuring heirs. But were these structured, widespread practices, or just occasional indulgences by anxious families? Some say the famous popularity of certain foods, like truffles, oysters, or artichokes, was tied to fertility beliefs, while others argue this connection is overblown by later romantic imaginations. Picture the scene: a Florentine street alive with the scent of oranges and fresh bread, musicians plucking lutes as garlands sway above. Young men in bright tunics serenade women at windows, tossing flowers or cheeky verses. Behind closed doors, families discuss whether to sponsor a fertility charm blessed by a local midwife, while upstairs, a fresco of Venus watches silently from the ceiling. And then there's the humor. Renaissance doctors sometimes prescribed surprisingly odd remedies for infertility. One suggestion involved wearing amulets made from rabbit bones or sleeping with specific herbs tucked under the mattress. Another recommended that couples eat roasted pigeon to encourage virility. It's hard not to imagine the awkward dinner conversation. "Darling, finish your pigeon. The doctor says our dynasty depends on it." But beneath the laughter lies earnest desire. The Renaissance obsession with heirs mirrored that of other courts across the world. Wealth and power depended on children, and children depended on both biology and belief. Fertility was painted, sung, prayed for, and in some cases, quite literally paraded down the street. You imagine yourself walking beneath frescoed arches, pausing by a fountain where a sculpted nymph spills water endlessly into a marble basin. The air is filled with the echo of bells and the flutter of festival ribbons. Fertility here is everywhere, in the flowers, in the canvases, in the roasted pigeons set on long oak tables. And though wrapped in art and allegory, the Renaissance made no secret of its conviction. Life continues only if seeds, in every form, are nurtured and celebrated. Now you drift eastward into Mughal India, where fertility rituals were woven into the grand rhythms of courtly life, village customs, and the blending of Hindu, Islamic, and folk traditions. Here, fertility was not just a private matter but a part of cosmic order, reflected in both the emperor's gardens and the smallest charms hung above a villager's bed. The mainstream fact, the Mughal Empire, with its Persianate Islamic court culture, absorbed and reinterpreted many fertility symbols from Indian traditions. Emperor Babur and later Akbar were famously fascinated by gardens, not merely for their beauty, but for their role as symbols of paradise and abundance. The carefully designed charbagh gardens with flowing water and fourfold divisions were more than aesthetic. They represented fertility, life, and divine blessing. Meanwhile, women in the harem often participated in rituals involving offerings of fruits, flowers, and sweets to encourage pregnancy or ensure the health of children. The quirky tidbit, Mughal court records mention astrologers prescribing highly specific timing for royal intimacy. The stars had to align, quite literally, before an emperor and his consort could attempt conception. Imagine waiting for your local stargazer to tell you, yes, tonight at precisely 9:47 p.m. Mars is favorable. Go forth and be fruitful. It makes modern fertility apps seem downright simple. On the folk side, rural communities across India celebrated seasonal fertility festivals, many of which the Mughal chroniclers noted with curiosity. Holi, for example, was associated with fertility as well as renewal, its bright powders symbolizing life and love. Women sang bawdy songs and playfully drenched men with colored water, a ritual that mixed joy, flirtation, and the hope of fruitful unions. The Mughal elites sometimes joined these celebrations, blurring the lines between refined court life and earthy village practices. And then there were foods, always foods. Pomegranates were prized as fertility symbols, their ruby seeds linked to abundance and procreation. Mangoes, with their lush sweetness, were another favorite, often exchanged between families as auspicious gifts. A Mughal love letter might even include metaphors of ripe fruits, subtly blending romance with fertility imagery. Historians still debate how much of this was sincere belief versus cultural performance. Did the emperors themselves truly believe the timing of stars controlled conception, or was it part of a larger political theater of cosmic alignment, showing that even the heavens sanctioned their heirs? Some argue these rituals were mostly symbolic, reinforcing dynastic legitimacy, while others insist they revealed genuine anxieties about fertility in a world where infant mortality was high and succession uncertain. Picture the scene: a courtyard lit by lanterns, jasmine perfuming the night air. Women in embroidered saris lay out trays of sweetmeats, while an astrologer squints at the sky, declaring Saturn's shadow both a blessing and a warning. Behind palace walls, a fountain splashes, its channels feeding green parterres of roses and citrus trees. Fertility is everywhere, in the pomegranate juice staining a nobleman's fingers, in the laughter of Holi, in the carefully planned gardens meant to mirror eternity. And then, as you walk the palace corridors in your imagination, you notice something quieter. Tiny amulets tied with red thread, tucked into cradles or hung above doorways. Even in the grandeur of the Mughal court, simple folk practices survived, whispered reminders that life was fragile and precious. A dynasty's glory depended on the same things as a villager's family: the hope for children, the rituals that promised them, and the prayers that they might live. Fertility here is both cosmic and earthy, both a matter of stars and of soil. The Mughal world made it art, science, devotion, and daily life all at once. You move now into the cool stone corridors of medieval monasteries, where celibacy was the public vow, yet fertility rituals lurked just outside the cloister walls. The tension was sharp. Monks and nuns renounced physical intimacy, but their communities remained tied to peasants whose survival hinged on fertility, of livestock, fields, and families. And so monasteries, despite their vows, often found themselves curiously entangled in fertility rites. The mainstream fact, in medieval Europe, monasteries were major landowners, and agricultural productivity was central to their wealth. Monks blessed fields, sprinkled holy water on seed grain, and prayed for livestock to thrive. Fertility, though not spoken in sexual terms within the cloister, was reframed as agricultural abundance, safe territory for men and women sworn to chastity. The Benedictine motto, ora et labora, pray and work, included tending orchards, brewing ale, and keeping herds, all of which required a constant awareness of fertility cycles. The quirky tidbit: some monasteries reportedly kept relics believed to aid fertility. In one convent in France, women visited a carved wooden statue of Saint Guinefort. Yes, the same legendary dog saint condemned by the church. Women prayed at his shrine for milk flow and safe childbirth, despite ecclesiastical disapproval. Elsewhere, monks guarded relics said to help barren couples conceive: bones, girdles, even a vial of supposed Virgin Mary's milk. Imagine the scandal if Amazon had a monastic fertility aid section. 2-day shipping on miracle girdles. Historians still argue whether these practices were official endorsements or tolerated folk customs. Did monks secretly believe in the power of these relics, or did they merely allow them to attract pilgrims and donations? Some records suggest abbots quietly encouraged them, while others imply the opposite, stern sermons railing against superstition. The truth, as always, probably lay somewhere between economics and faith. Picture the scene. A chilly spring morning, dew dripping from cloister arches. Monks shuffle in silence, but just beyond the monastery gate, peasants gather with baskets of eggs and sprigs of rosemary. They whisper prayers and slip coins to a lay brother who quietly leads them to a relic said to bless wombs or protect infants. No loud proclamations, just hushed ritual, somewhere between faith and desperation. And then there are the manuscripts, those illuminated marginalia where monks doodled rabbits, snails, and fertility symbols alongside holy text. You've probably seen one of those cheeky drawings online. A monk spends all day copying psalms, then sneaks in a tiny rabbit delivering a baby in the corner of the page. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was subconscious fixation. Either way, fertility found its way into ink and parchment even when vows forbade it. You tread softly through the cloister, hearing chants echo in stone. A monk bends over his breviary, lips moving silently. Outside, a farmer ties a charm of herbs to a cow's stall, muttering a prayer half Christian, half pagan. And you realize the monastery might wall itself off, but the wider world kept pressing fertility into its orbit. Even silence couldn't stop it. Fertility here is reframed, sanctified, sometimes denied, but never gone. It lingered in fields, relics, and marginal doodles, in the spaces monks tried to keep pure, yet could not quite empty of life. You step now into the ornate palaces of the early modern courts, where fertility rituals took on the weight of dynastic survival. Kings and queens were not just people with families, they were engines of lineage, continuity, and political alliances. Every kiss, every child, every miscarriage could tip the balance of power in Europe. Fertility here was not a private affair. It was a matter of statecraft, whispered in corridors, embroidered into tapestries, and even judged by courtiers who pretended to be discreet, but rarely were. The mainstream fact, in France, the royal bed was a stage. At Versailles, the marriage of Louis XIV's son to Maria Theresa of Spain was consummated with courtiers literally standing by, witnesses to the moment that was supposed to ensure an heir. This was not voyeurism for entertainment. It was a political necessity, proof that the marriage was valid and the dynasty secure. The idea that a ruler's body belonged partly to the realm was taken quite literally. The quirky tidbit: some kings and queens resorted to bizarre fertility remedies. In 16th century England, there are rumors that Henry VIII's physicians recommended a concoction involving rabbit testicles ground into wine to help with conception. Hardly a recipe you'd find on Pinterest today. Across Europe, couples were advised to sleep with fertility charms under their pillows, including carved amulets shaped like acorns, thought to symbolize life and potency. Imagine trying to get restful sleep with a pocket full of acorns rattling around your mattress. Historians still argue whether these rituals were believed sincerely or merely tolerated as hopeful gestures. Did kings and queens genuinely trust these odd cures? Or were they a form of theater to reassure nervous courtiers that everything possible was being done to secure heirs? Letters and diaries sometimes reveal earnest belief, while others hint at sarcasm, as if even monarchs chuckled privately at the absurdity. Picture the tension in a gilded chamber. A queen lies in bed, her ladies-in-waiting bustling about with trays of spiced wine and bundles of herbs. In the corner, a priest blesses the bedstead. Outside, courtiers whisper, calculating the political value of a future child. You can almost hear the soft crackle of the fireplace. Smell the wax of candles and feel the hush as everyone waits. Everyone. That is, except the poor queen, who has no escape from this role written on her body. And sometimes fertility rituals went public in pageantry. In certain courts, elaborate ceremonies celebrated royal pregnancies. Parades, masks, even bonfires meant to warm the womb. These weren't just celebrations of family news. They were symbolic fertility rites performed at a national scale, binding the body of the monarch to the fortunes of the state. You imagine walking through Versailles or Hampton Court, brushing your hand across embroidered cushions, each stitch carrying dynastic hope. You hear the nervous laughter of courtiers, smell rosewater sprinkled on sheets, and sense the heavy truth. In palaces, fertility was both sacred and suffocating. Kings and queens became actors in a drama that never allowed privacy. And so, while monasteries struggled to hush fertility within vows, palaces displayed it under chandeliers. Both settings remind you, fertility was never just personal. It was public, political, and often uncomfortably theatrical. You find yourself now wandering into the guarded chambers of dynasties beyond Europe, imperial harems and courts, where fertility rituals shaped entire empires. Here, fertility was not only about producing heirs, but about balancing rivalries, stabilizing succession, and weaving politics into intimacy. If Versailles turned the royal bed into a stage, the Ottoman, Mughal, and Chinese courts turned it into a vast labyrinth of intrigue, velvet cushions, and whispered prayers. The mainstream fact, in the Ottoman Empire, the harem was not just a romanticized palace of women, as Orientalist paintings would later depict. It was a political machine. The sultan's fertility was the empire's lifeline, and concubines who bore sons gained immense power. The practice of safeguarding succession sometimes even led to grim outcomes. Siblings eliminated so one heir could survive. Fertility here meant survival, and it was ruthlessly managed. The quirky tidbit: in some harems, women drank concoctions of pomegranate seeds mixed with honey, believed to boost fertility. In Mughal India, women sometimes bathed in perfumed milk as part of fertility rituals, with petals floating in the water, as if turning the womb into a flower garden. Meanwhile, in Ming China, manuals of bedchamber arts advised emperors on how to balance yin and yang through carefully measured encounters, sometimes even dictating how many times an emperor should sleep with a concubine from a particular zodiac sign. Imagine HR trying to keep those charts updated. Historians still argue whether these rituals were strictly believed, or whether they were performance designed to reassure both rulers and ruled. Were emperors sincerely following Taoist manuals to manage cosmic balance, or were these just sophisticated ways of tracking succession politics? The debate continues, as fragments of documents reveal both seriousness and satire. You picture yourself in a Mughal harem chamber, golden light filtering through jolly screens, jasmine incense curling in the air, voices humming lullabies as a concubine cradles an infant. Down the corridor, eunuchs record the births, tallying the empire's future like careful accountants. Or in Beijing's Forbidden City, a eunuch gently unrolls a scroll covered in symbols, advising the emperor which night is most auspicious for conception. Every act is freighted with layers of cosmic and political meaning, and yet, beneath the marble domes and lacquered screens, you sense the same universal human worry. Will there be a child? Will the line continue? Will tomorrow still belong to us? Fertility here is both personal longing and public destiny, wrapped in silks and incense, measured in suns and alliances. You stroll quietly through those halls, hearing laughter behind latticed walls, smelling cardamom and sandalwood, sensing the strange weight of rituals that promised cosmic harmony, yet also served dynastic control. And once again, fertility reveals itself as both intimate and impossibly public, woven into the heartbeat of empires. You drift now into the royal chambers of the Middle Ages, where fertility wasn't just whispered about. It was staged in rituals so curious that modern readers sometimes blink twice when they discover them. In castles from England to the Holy Roman Empire, the fate of dynasties hinged on producing heirs, and the business of conception became a semi-public affair cloaked in ceremony, superstition, and sometimes farce. The mainstream fact, in medieval Europe, royal marriages were not considered fully valid until consummation, and yes, witnesses were sometimes present outside the chamber door. In a few especially tense unions, attendants might linger within earshot, ready to attest to the success of the night. The marriage bed was therefore a political arena, privacy traded for legitimacy. It was awkward, ceremonial, and, in a sense, unavoidable. The quirky tidbit: certain royal households kept fertility pillows, embroidered with charms or even filled with symbolic herbs. Some kings and queens were urged to place statues of saints near the bed, or to drink wine stirred with powdered antlers before retiring. In one case, a German duchess reportedly bathed in wine mixed with rosemary, not for skincare but because it was thought to warm the womb. Imagine explaining that spa treatment to your modern esthetician. Yes, I'll take the fertility vintage soak, please. Historians still argue whether these rituals were sincerely trusted or largely for show. Were kings and queens deeply invested in the magic of antler powder, or did they smile wearily at yet another physician's concoction? Some documents reveal genuine anxiety, others reveal almost comical resignation. The truth probably leaned toward belief, because when the stability of the throne was at stake, even the oddest ritual seemed worth trying. Picture it: a cold stone bedchamber, the fire flickering low. Servants have laid linen scented with lavender. A priest has blessed the bedstead, and outside the heavy oak door, courtiers murmur, straining to hear something. You stand among them, feeling the tension, the strange mix of sacred duty and private moment that has been transformed into dynastic performance, and sometimes these rituals spilled into full courtly spectacle. A royal couple's morning after might be greeted with discreet congratulations, or even small public ceremonies confirming the hope of heirs to come. Fertility was not a secret. It was a state concern, a spectacle wrapped in velvet curtains and incense smoke. You walk the echoing halls, sensing both the pressure and the absurdity. Fertility here was cloaked in rituals both serious and silly, where the line between devotion and desperation blurred. Once again, the royal body was not its own. It was everyone's hope, everyone's business, and everyone's anxious whisper in the corridors. You ease now into the hushed twilight of sacred spaces, where mystical fertility rites intertwined with cosmic symbolism. While courts and monasteries played their roles, there were also enclaves of mystics, alchemists, and visionaries who treated fertility not merely as reproduction, but as a key to unlocking divine mysteries. Here, the union of bodies was mirrored as the union of heavens and earth. Yin and yang, sun and moon, grand metaphors layered onto intimate realities. The mainstream fact: in medieval Kabbalistic tradition, fertility was sometimes described in mystical language as the union of the Sephirot, divine emanations that represented masculine and feminine aspects of God. To conceive children was to mirror the cosmic balance, to participate in divine creation itself. The household bed could thus be cast as a miniature temple, where ritual gestures and prayers aligned human intimacy with celestial harmony. The quirky tidbit: some mystical manuals prescribe surprisingly theatrical rituals. In certain Renaissance circles, alchemists believed that wearing garments dyed with saffron or sleeping beneath sheets embroidered with planetary symbols could attune fertility with the stars. One bizarre instruction claimed that a couple should eat roasted dove hearts for a month to invite conception. Imagine explaining that at the market. Yes, I'll take 31 dove hearts. It's for cosmic reasons. Historians still argue whether these accounts reflect actual practices or more symbolic teachings. Were couples sincerely roasting dove hearts and tracing planetary sigils onto their bed sheets? Or were such instructions metaphors, allegories for spiritual alignment? Some argue that later readers took poetic metaphors far too literally, while others suggest these rituals did indeed happen in esoteric circles. The debate, like the stars themselves, remains unresolved. You picture yourself in a candlelit chamber, scrolls scattered across a wooden table, the smell of resin and myrrh heavy in the air. A mystic murmurs chants in Hebrew or Latin, his finger tracing celestial diagrams inked in gold. Across the room, a young couple kneels nervously, caught between awe and awkwardness. Is this a prayer, a ritual, a performance? Perhaps all three at once. Even in far-off places, echoes of this mystical framing appeared. In Taoist China, bedchamber texts describe the emperor's union with his consorts as restoring cosmic order. In Sufi poetry, metaphors of divine love often shimmered with imagery of union, desire, and creation. Fertility was elevated into metaphysics, a bridge between human longing and universal balance. And so you linger in that space, half temple, half bedroom, where fertility was neither fully private nor fully public, but instead painted across the heavens. You hear the scratch of quills, the whisper of mantras, the rustle of embroidered cloths, all bound together by the unshakable sense that human creation mirrored something vast, eternal, and divine. You wander now into the world of folk healers and village wise women, where fertility rites slipped between superstition and survival. Far from royal courts or scholarly mystics, these were rituals born in kitchens, barns, and moonlit fields. If the palace made fertility theatrical and the monastery tried to sanctify it, the village simply tried to make it work, by herbs, charms, and a healthy dash of hope. The mainstream fact, in many parts of medieval and early modern Europe, midwives doubled as fertility advisors. They prepared herbal remedies from plants like rue, pennyroyal, or mugwort, sometimes as contraceptives, sometimes as supposed enhancers of conception. Their knowledge was practical, passed down orally, and often mistrusted by official church authorities. But for ordinary people, the village midwife or cunning woman was the first stop for any fertility worry. The quirky tidbit, some rituals involved truly peculiar items. In German folklore, women struggling to conceive were told to sit on fields freshly plowed at dawn, the warmth of the earth believed to awaken fertility. Elsewhere in Slavic villages, couples were advised to jump together over bonfires during midsummer festivals, ensuring both purification and the spark of new life. You can imagine the scene, two slightly nervous peasants trying not to trip mid-leap while everyone cheers. Nothing kills romance like a twisted ankle. Historians still argue whether these fertility charms were taken as literal magic or more as community bonding rituals. Did peasants genuinely believe a midsummer leap guaranteed babies, or was it more a joyful communal gesture that coincidentally reinforced the importance of family? Surviving fragments of songs and folk tales hint at both seriousness and humor, sometimes the same ritual carrying different meanings depending on who you asked. Picture the setting: a smoky kitchen, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, a wise woman grinding seeds in a mortar. She whispers instructions. Place this charm beneath the mattress, burn this herb before dawn, tie this red ribbon around your wrist. Or imagine a summer field, peasants singing, children chasing fireflies, couples nervously preparing to leap across glowing embers. Fertility here was woven seamlessly into the cycle of seasons, never far from the soil, the hearth, or the fire. And yet, danger lurked. Many wise women accused of witchcraft were condemned not only for supposed curses, but also for their fertility charms. What was once seen as helpful could, in a fearful moment, be branded heresy. Knowledge that had soothed families for generations suddenly turned into grounds for trial. As you walk through the flickering firelight, you sense both comfort and risk. Fertility in villages was hopeful, earthy, and immediate, but also precarious, always shadowed by suspicion. You hear laughter, smell burning herbs, and feel the pulse of life continuing despite fear. You slip now into the brightly painted temples of ancient India, where fertility rites were interwoven with devotion, art, and rhythm. Here, fertility was not only about children, but about cosmic energy, balance, and the dance of gods and humans together. Where medieval Europe tiptoed around the subject, Hindu traditions often carved it in stone, sang it in hymns, and placed it boldly at the center of religious life. The mainstream fact, many temples across India feature lingam and yoni symbols, representations of Shiva and Shakti, the divine masculine and feminine. These were not considered scandalous but sacred, visual metaphors for cosmic creation. Worshippers would bathe these symbols with milk, honey, and water, acts meant to bless fertility in the family and abundance in the fields. For ordinary people, fertility rites here weren't hidden. They were part of everyday devotion. The quirky tidbit: some villages celebrated spring festivals with playful fertility games. Women might swing from tall ropes tied to trees, the upward arc seen as invitations for abundant harvests and healthy pregnancies. In certain traditions, men and women sprinkled each other with colored powders. Yes, precursors to holy celebrations, believed to awaken both joy and fertility. You can almost imagine a medieval European courtier fainting in shock at such open cheer, while villagers in India simply laughed, danced, and sang. Historians still argue whether the explicit carvings on temples like Khajuraho were literal instructional guides to fertility, symbolic allegories of cosmic unity, or simply artistic exuberance. Were these sculptures manuals for couples, or meditations on the play of life? The debate continues, but the fact remains: such temples were not fringe. They were commissioned by kings and patronized by entire communities. Picture yourself walking barefoot across warm stone, the scent of marigold garlands in the air, the low hum of mantras vibrating through carved halls. The walls are alive with figures, dancers, lovers, gods, and humans, each frozen in movement, each a reminder of fertility's presence in every breath. Outside, children laugh as they chase each other. Farmers bring baskets of rice to offer, and musicians beat drums that echo like heartbeats across the courtyard. And fertility wasn't only about human children. It extended to cattle, crops, and even rainfall. Villagers prayed that Shiva's union with Shakti would bring monsoons, that Lakshmi's blessings would fill the granaries, that every seed sown would answer with abundance. Fertility here was a cosmic contract, binding temples, fields, and households in one unbroken rhythm. You drift through the incense smoke, hearing bells chime, feeling the pulse of drums in your chest. Fertility is no secret here. It is celebrated openly, joyously, a tapestry of ritual and life woven together without shame. You move now into the hushed courtyards of imperial China, where fertility rituals blended with Confucian duty, Taoist balance, and the bureaucratic machinery of dynasties. Here, fertility was not just personal hope, it was state policy, carefully documented, regulated, and woven into the rhythms of heaven and earth. The mainstream fact: the emperor was known as the son of heaven, and his fertility was tied directly to the prosperity of the empire. Producing sons was considered essential for maintaining the mandate of heaven, that cosmic approval granting a dynasty its right to rule. Imperial records meticulously documented pregnancies, births, and even miscarriages within the palace, as if dynastic stability could be ensured by sheer paperwork. The quirky tidbit: Taoist manuals of the bedchamber arts recommended unusual practices for enhancing fertility. Some advised that men should time intercourse with specific lunar phases, believing the moon's yin energy influenced conception. Others suggested bizarre dietary aids, such as consuming tiger bone powder or dried seahorses, which were thought to enhance virility. Imagine your local pharmacist trying to explain that prescription. 2 dried seahorses daily. Take with rice wine. Historians still argue whether emperors actually followed these intricate prescriptions, or whether the manuals were more theoretical than practical. Some court records suggest ritual timing of imperial couplings was enforced by palace officials, while others imply emperors largely ignored such strict regimens. Did dynasties genuinely trust cosmic calendars, or were these rituals more about appearances and reinforcing ideology? The debate lingers in fragments of memorials and edicts. Picture yourself walking through the Forbidden City, vermilion walls glowing in late sunlight, eunuchs bustling silently, scrolls of astrology unrolled on lacquered tables. A senior official bows deeply as he presents the auspicious night for conception, chosen by the stars. Beyond a carved screen, an imperial consort waits, dressed in embroidered silk heavy with dragons and phoenixes, symbols of balance, union, and fertility. You can almost hear the rustle of silk, the faint scratch of a brush recording every detail in neat calligraphy. Fertility rituals here were entwined with cosmic order. It wasn't merely about producing an heir, it was about demonstrating that heaven and earth were aligned, that the emperor's household echoed celestial harmony. Even incense burned in palace chambers was chosen for balance. Sandalwood to calm, musk to stimulate, and jasmine to symbolize renewal. As you stroll beneath the eaves of carved dragons, you sense the weight of expectation pressing down on every chamber. Fertility in imperial China was not hidden but choreographed. Time to the moon, catalogued by scribes and justified by the cosmos itself. You drift now into the towering temples and pyramid complexes of the Aztec and Maya, where fertility rituals pulsed with blood, maize, and the turning of the sun. Here, fertility was not only about human heirs, but about the cycles of crops, rain, and cosmic survival. To feed the gods was to ensure that people too could continue. The mainstream fact. For the Aztecs, fertility was inseparable from agriculture. Maize was the staff of life, and deities like Chicomacoatl, goddess of corn, were honored with elaborate ceremonies to guarantee good harvests. Offerings of food, flowers, and incense were common, but in some cases ritual bloodletting was seen as necessary to nourish the gods who, in turn, nourished humanity. The fertility of fields mirrored the fertility of bodies. The quirky tidbit. Maya kings performed fertility rituals that involved piercing their own tongues or genitals, drawing blood onto paper and burning it as an offering. The smoke rising was believed to open portals to the divine, ensuring cosmic renewal and the prosperity of the people. Imagine your boss announcing, "Annual review coming up. Don't forget your sacred bloodletting kit." Not quite the HR retreat most of us expect. Historians still argue whether these rituals were experienced as acts of personal devotion, theatrical performances for the masses, or cosmic duties that rulers performed reluctantly. Some inscriptions suggest kings saw themselves as living bridges between human and divine fertility, while others imply they performed under social and political pressure. Were they pious acts or political necessities? The debate continues, carved into stone and painted in codices. You picture yourself in a bustling plaza, drums echoing, conch shells blowing, dancers painted in bright colors swirling in circles. Priests climb the steps of a temple, carrying offerings of maize and cacao. The air is thick with copal incense, sweet and resinous, while the crowd chants prayers for rain and crops. Above it all, the sun burns down, relentless, reminding everyone that life depends on balance between sacrifice and abundance, and fertility here stretched beyond crops. In Aztec ritual calendars, marriages were arranged on auspicious days chosen by diviners, ensuring not only social harmony, but also divine blessing for fertility. Even childbirth was ritualized, with midwives chanting prayers comparing labor to battle, casting the newborn child as a tiny warrior entering life. Fertility wasn't hidden. It was central, celebrated, and constantly reenacted through ritual cycles. As you walk away from the plaza, the drums still rumble in your chest. You smell roasted maize, feel flower petals crunch beneath your feet, and realize that for these civilizations, fertility was not a secret rite, but the very heartbeat of existence. Now your journey carries you to the misty islands of Polynesia, where fertility rituals blended seamlessly with ocean tides, star paths, and the rhythms of voyaging canoes. Here, fertility was about balance with nature, ensuring both the continuation of family lines and the abundance of the sea. The mainstream fact, in many Polynesian societies, fertility deities were tied directly to the ocean and sky. Tangaroa, god of the sea, was invoked for bountiful fishing, while Hina, goddess of the moon, governed tides, menstrual cycles, and fertility of women. Seasonal rituals were synchronized with lunar calendars, linking reproduction with cosmic cycles. The moon was not merely a light in the night sky, it was a timekeeper of life. The quirky tidbit: on some islands, fertility rituals included offering the first fish catch or the first taro harvest to the gods. This meant that while everyone else might be hungry, the very best and freshest foods went to divine beings. You can imagine a fisherman saying, "Yes, I caught this massive tuna, but no one touch it. We've got to hand it over to the gods first. Hard luck for dinner, but good luck for the future." There's an ongoing scholarly debate over whether Polynesian fertility rituals were primarily agricultural, maritime, or genealogical in nature. Some argue they were about keeping the gods happy so food would keep coming in. Others suggest the rituals reinforced chiefly authority, with leaders proving they could keep the cosmos aligned. Still others emphasize the genealogical aspect. Procreation was seen as extending not just families, but entire cosmic lineages tracing back to divine ancestors. You picture yourself under a starlit sky, a circle of people gathered around a fire on the beach. Drums pulse softly while chants rise and fall like waves. Offerings of coconuts, fish, and flowers are set afloat in small woven baskets, drifting out into the dark Pacific waters. Elders retell the story of how the first humans emerged from a giant clamshell, their lineage forever tied to the sea. The atmosphere is neither solemn nor frenzied, but gently reverent. Fertility here is celebrated not with blood or fear, but with trust in cycles. The rising moon, the spawning fish, the sprouting yam. Families gather to teach children chants and dances that encode ancestral wisdom, ensuring that cultural fertility, knowledge itself, passes from one generation to the next. As you close your eyes, you can almost hear the sound of waves lapping on the shore, mingling with the cadence of distant chants. You feel the breeze carrying the salt air, the scent of roasted breadfruit, the hush of paddles slicing water. Fertility here is inseparable from journey, from migration, from the endless renewal of life across ocean horizons. You drift now into the sweeping valleys of the Inca Empire, high in the Andes, where fertility rituals were bound tightly to mountains, maize, and the pulse of the sun. In this empire of stone terraces and golden temples, fertility wasn't only about children, it was about sustaining a vast agricultural system carved into nearly impossible landscapes. The mainstream fact, Inti, the sun god, was worshipped as the primary source of fertility for both crops and people. The great temple of Coricancha in Cusco was lined with sheets of gold, reflecting sunlight in dazzling displays meant to honor the power of Inti. Priests staged rituals during solstices and equinoxes to ensure balance between sun and soil, which directly impacted harvests and population health. The quirky tidbit, the Inca sometimes buried miniature figurines, tiny llamas carved of silver, or maize cobs fashioned from gold, into fields before planting season. These offerings were thought to coax Pachamama, the Earth Mother, into blessing the soil. It's as if farmers were leaving toy versions of crops and animals to persuade the gods to send the real thing. Imagine today's gardeners slipping Barbie-sized corn dolls into the dirt and saying, "Okay, soil spirits, your turn." Historians still argue whether human sacrifices, particularly of children in the Capacocha rituals, were directly tied to fertility rites or were broader acts of cosmic reciprocity. Some scholars insist these ceremonies were about ensuring agricultural fertility during times of drought, while others see them as expressions of loyalty to the empire and its gods. The interpretation remains tangled in the thin mountain air, where myths, politics, and devotion overlap. Picture yourself on a crisp morning at the edge of a terraced field. Farmers chant in Quechua as they plant maize kernels, their hands moving in rhythm with the beat of drums. Nearby, a priest sprinkles chicha beer onto the earth as an offering, the liquid seeping into the soil like a libation to Pachamama. Overhead, the mountains, APUs, sacred guardians, stand watch, snow-capped and silent, yet deeply alive in the worldview of the people. The empire's fertility rituals were not hidden or scandalous, but woven into every layer of daily life. Marriage festivals, planting ceremonies, and even public feasts reinforced the message. Fertility was collective survival. To bring children into the world was to extend the empire. To nurture crops was to sustain the gods' favor. As the sun tilts westward, you can almost feel the high-altitude chill settle into your bones, softened by the warmth of ritual firelight. Drums echo through the valleys, carrying a rhythm that feels eternal, steady, cyclical, unbroken, just like the fertility that the Inca so carefully courted from their gods, their earth, and their sun. You step softly now into the courtly chambers of the Ming dynasty, where silk screens whisper behind lacquered walls, and rituals for balance and harmony extended even into the most intimate aspects of palace life. Here, fertility was a political necessity. Producing heirs meant stability for dynasties, and rituals were devised not only to honor ancestors, but to align the emperor's household with cosmic order. The mainstream fact, the emperor himself was regarded as the son of heaven, whose body symbolized the empire. His ability to father children was equated with the vitality of the entire realm. Imperial physicians monitored his health with meticulous care, prescribing tonics of ginseng and deer antler, believed to invigorate both body and lineage. Every detail, His meals, his rest, his encounters, was tracked with the diligence of a ledger. The quirky tidbit: the palace kept what might be called rotational schedules for concubines. Court officials, not the emperor himself, decided who would share his bed and when, using slips of ivory marked with names. These were placed in trays, sometimes even chilled in bowls of water to prevent tampering. The chosen slip was then presented ceremoniously and the concubine summoned. It was bureaucratic intimacy at its peak, a civil service exam, but for romance. Historians still argue whether Taoist-inspired sexual practices like controlled breathing and carefully measured intimacy were genuinely adopted in the Ming court or were mostly theoretical ideas promoted by scholars. Some texts insist emperors followed esoteric techniques to balance yin and yang, while others dismiss these as moralized fictions invented long after. The line between practice and philosophy blurs, leaving us with a puzzle wrapped in silk. Picture yourself in a candlelit chamber, the scent of sandalwood hanging heavy. A scribe sits quietly in the corner, ink brush poised, recording the event not for scandal but for posterity and order. Outside, drums and bells sound at the shift of the watch. Within, the emperor is less a man than a cosmic pivot, enacting rituals that mirrored the heavens' balance. For concubines, these rituals were not simply private encounters, but performances of duty. Their bodies were expected to harmonize with the cycles of the moon, the health of the dynasty, and the alignment of stars. Even the architecture reinforced fertility symbolism. Round courtyards representing heaven, square bases symbolizing earth, merging into the emperor's authority. As you linger in this chamber of silk and ritual, you sense how thoroughly the private was braided into the public. Every whispered word or drawn curtain was linked to the fates of millions, as though the pulse of the dynasty beat in time with the quiet breathing of two figures behind closed doors. You move now to the final chamber, where modern myths and whispered secrets intertwine, and you realize that royal sex rites have always been less about scandal and more about symbolism, order, and the curious ways humans anchor power in intimacy. Across cultures, from Egypt to Inca valleys, from French courts to Ming palaces, fertility rituals, bedroom politics, and whispered practices were staged not as private curiosities but as cosmic obligations. The hidden histories you've wandered through reveal not only what rulers did behind closed doors, but also how societies projected hopes, fears, and anxieties onto the most personal of human acts. The mainstream fact: in almost every monarchy studied, lineage was equated with legitimacy. Without children, dynasties faltered, thrones cracked, and empires crumbled. This fact alone infused private rituals with extraordinary weight, transforming intimacy into statecraft. The quirky tidbit: in early modern Europe, marriage consummations were sometimes witnessed, yes, witnessed, by trusted courtiers, who documented the event like notaries ensuring a contract was sealed. Imagine trying to relax under such conditions while a man in a ruffled collar clears his throat loudly in the corner. You probably wouldn't survive that sort of pressure, or at least you wouldn't get much sleep. Historians still argue whether many of the so-called secret rites described in later sources were ever truly practiced, or whether they were imagined by rivals, satirists, or later storytellers with a flair for embellishment. The truth, it seems, often lies in the hazy border between fact and performance, politics and myth. And so, as your journey comes to a close, you recline with a peculiar sense of calm. You've traveled through gilded chambers and windswept terraces, wandered candlelit halls and mountain fields, and discovered that the rites history kept hidden were as much about crops, cosmos, and crowns as they were about flesh. The echoes of drums, chants, and whispered vows fade into silence, leaving you with the comfort that history's strangest secrets are often less salacious than soothing. Rituals meant to bind people together, to balance chaos and to keep dynasties alive. Now, let the rhythm slow. The voices grow quieter, the imagery softer. Picture those vast palaces and terraces at night, empty now, their fires burned low, their corridors echoing only with the sound of wind. The rituals have ended, the duties fulfilled. All that remains is stillness. Your breath finds its own steady cadence, like footsteps fading on ancient stone. With each exhale, the weight of centuries lifts, and with each inhale, you draw in the calm of those silent chambers. History's hidden stories fold into gentle shadows, leaving you at rest. The past no longer demands your attention. It only cradles you in its quiet embrace. You are safe, you are calm, and you can let go. Drift with the lingering hum of forgotten ceremonies, where power once trembled and laughter once echoed, and now only peace remains. Good night.